Straits brings legal and business insights at the intersection of the shipping and energy sectors. This podcast series offers trends, developments, challenges and topics of interest from Reed Smith litigation, regulatory and finance lawyers across our network of global offices. If you have any questions about the topics discussed on this podcast, please do contact our speakers. Hello everyone and welcome back to Trading Straits. I'm Nick Austin, a partner in the shipping team at Reed Smith in London. I'm joined today by my colleagues Brett Hillis and Julie Vaughan, who are also based in the London office with me. We all work in industry sectors which are going to be impacted by the EU Emissions Trading System, or EU ETS for short, ranging from myself in the shipping sector to Julie in the environmental world and Brett in the commodities space. In this podcast today, we're going to be looking at the recent development of the EU ETS across the industry sectors and discussing some of its key features and some of the challenges. Julie, if we could come to you first, perhaps you could give us an overview, if you could, of the EU ETS and highlight some of its central points.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Yes, the EU ETS is the EU's flagship climate change regime. What it's designed to do is to incentivise industrial operators to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And it was first introduced back in 2003. And it was actually based on an original UK pilot scheme a long time ago that no longer exists. We're currently in the fourth phase of the EU ETS scheme, and that runs from 2021 through to 2030. But the whole scheme has undergone a lot of changes over the course of time. It's what's known as a cap and trade scheme. And so what it does is to create a limited supply of instruments called allowances, which have a value and they can be traded in the marketplace. And Brett will come on to that a little bit later. The total number of allowances that are issued in the system each year, they're issued by the member states, but the total number is controlled centrally by the European Commission. And that's based on adding up all the forecast of emissions for industrial facilities that fall in the scope of the scheme. But critically, a percentage is then deducted, applying what's called the linear reduction factor. And what that does is to create a shortage of allowances, which then drives operators to take measures to reduce their emissions or to avoid creating emissions, which helps to reduce their compliance costs. And that's how it tries to promote climate change reduction, emissions reduction. The operators of the facilities that are in scope, what they need to do is to obtain a permit, greenhouse gas permit, which they get from their member state authorities. And then each year, at the end of the year, what they have to do is monitor their emissions and then at the end of the year surrender an equivalent amount of the allowances to cover their emissions for that year. And the emissions that are covered by it, they're mainly carbon dioxide, although for certain sectors, actually, some other gases also have to be taken into account. And each allowance represents 1 tonne of carbon dioxide or the equivalent of the gases. If you don't comply with your obligations under the scheme, if you're an operator, then there are penalties and sanctions. And there are also some very detailed rules about monitoring your emissions and how you report them and verifying that report before you submit it to the regulator and so on. So there's a whole load of detail out there. Originally, these allowances were issued free of charge, mostly, but that's been phased out over the course of time, with the exception of certain industries who are very heavy energy users, electricity users in particular, people like cement and steel manufacturers. They face a lot of competition from competitors outside the EU, and so there's some special rules for them. But generally speaking, if you hold allowances, they have to be in an account at what's called the Union Registry. The scheme initially focused on the most energy-intensive industrial sectors, but actually it includes any combustion facility over a certain threshold. It's 20 megawatt. But then it's been subsequently extended to cover aviation emissions, just recently transport and heating fuels, and also shipping, as we're going to be discussing on this podcast. So, Nick, regarding the application of the EU ETS to shipping, How do you think the EU ETS is going to be implemented in the maritime sector?
Yeah, that's right. Shipping is being brought into the scope of the ETS, I think with potentially significant implications for the industry. And that's happening, as you said, in 2024, when it expands into the maritime sector on vessels to begin with of more than 5,000 gross tonnes. The new regime is going to see obligations falling on what are defined as loosely as shipping companies, and they're going to need to set up new compliance procedures, including opening an operator account at the registry in which to hold allowances. And I know that Brett is going to be talking a little bit more about this shortly. But there is a pressing need, I think, for the shipping industry, from owners to charterers, ship managers, and others, to get to grips with the detail of the ETS now in order to ensure the compliance that they're going to need to demonstrate from just a few months away. Just to unpack that a bit, in each compliance year, shipping companies are going to have to surrender EU emissions allowances, EUAs, relating to their carbon emissions in that year. They're going to be provided with a free allocation to start with, and then additional EUAs can be purchased on the secondary market or at auctions arranged by certain platforms set up to do that. And the deadline for surrendering EUAs for a compliance year will be the 30th of September of the following year. So 2024 is the first year, and for that year, shipping companies, in terms of what they will need to surrender, will need to surrender 40%, or EUAs covering 40% of voyages within the EU, and 20% of emissions on voyages that are into or out of the EU. And as with so much environmental regulation and decarbonisation regulation at the moment, these percentages are going to tighten up. They'll increase in stages from 2024 through to 2026 to reach 100% of emissions on voyages within the EU and 50% of voyages into or out of the EU. So it will be an ever tightening regime. I mean, maybe there's an opportunity here, of course. Owners and managers are going to be primarily responsible for surrendering the allowances. They are going to want to pass on those costs, in most cases, to their charterers. And parties may look to trade in the EUs to turn a profit. We'll see how successful that will be. But there may well be regulatory aspects. I think there probably are regulatory aspects around that. But I'm going to leave that to Brett to comment on. But either way, the key, I think, is that the shipping industry and players and counterparties within it need to be looking at this now and looking at their contracts in particular in light of the new rules that are coming in. With that in mind, Brett, you've advised clients active in the EU emissions trading system for more than 15 years. What are the features of the market that the shipping industry you think really needs to watch out for?
Thanks very much, Nick. Thanks, everyone. So a few sort of points that I would make on this. I think the first one to make is that the shipping industry will be trading in the same allowances as everybody else. There's not going to be a separate category of shipping related allowances. And so the allowances that are purchased at auction by shipping companies are going to be fungible, fully fungible with all the other allowances. That differs from the original sort of situation with aviation, although now, in the same way, all of the allowances for aviation are fungible. So it's all going to be one market. Julie's kind of outlined some of the history of that market. And I think the thing I would say on that is it's a market that had its teething problems, but it's now very well respected, and that's probably, for better or worse, reflected in the price. We see that EUAs are at 85 euros or so, and have kept steadily at that kind of price for quite a long time. So it's a respected market. One of the things that you kind of highlighted, Nick, is around regulation. One of its features as a market is that EUAs themselves are treated under EU financial services law as financial instruments, and sort of contracts for the forward delivery of EUAs or cash settled contracts relating to EUAs are treated under EU financial services law as derivatives. So what does that mean? Well, what that means, what it doesn't mean is that everybody who participates in this market needs a kind of financial services license. That's not the case. Operators and sort of, the vast majority of people will be able to sort of participate in the market without that. But what they will need to do is to ensure that they can rely on an exemption under financial services law. So because it's a regulated market, participants need to look at their kind of regulatory sort of situation, make sure that they fall within the exemptions that are available. So that's probably the first aspect. In terms of what kind of market it is, I mean, you mentioned about the sort of primary auctions where people can purchase allowances. There's also a very sort of active secondary trading. Some of that is done on exchange. There are spot exchanges where allowances can be purchased, and also allowances can be purchased on futures markets. The most active market is ICE Index and their daily futures contract, which is probably the main instrument that's being used. And so people who want to kind of access that will typically need to enter into a relationship with a clearing member on that exchange in order to access it. There's also a thriving sort of OTC, over-the-counter trading market. That market, there are a lot of participants, so a number of banks and kind of investment banks, and potentially sort of quite a lot of kind of energy trading companies and kind of oil majors may be kind of participants in that market. And so there's some liquidity, there. So this is not for those people, not a new market, but obviously will be a new market for the shipping companies. Thinking about that, one sort of issue always with kind of legislation is territoriality. And of course, shipping is very much a business that sort of takes place, with participants outside the EU. So Julie, will shipping companies based outside the EU have any obligations under the scheme?
Yes, it's going to apply to any shipping company who's sending ships above the 5,000 gross tonnage weight threshold into an EU port, or sailing from an EU port, or whose ships sail between EU ports. So this is very much a piece of legislation where the EU is seeking to place obligations on companies which would ordinarily be outside of its jurisdiction. For enforcement purposes, enforcing this regime, shipping companies that have got an establishment in the EU, perhaps they're registered in an EU member state, will ordinarily be regulated by their home competent authority in that member state under this scheme. But that leaves a question as to who's going to regulate non-EU registered shipping companies who are sending ships in and out of the EU territory. And for those, what the European Commission is going to do is to have a look at with which member state they are sort of most closely associated. And the way that they've proposed to do that is to look at sort of where the most traffic goes, to which member state most of that company's ships travel. And what they'll do is they'll issue a list allocating companies to member states, so they'll then know which member state authorities will be regulating them. And that could make a practical difference because the way the EU ETS scheme works with regards to enforcement and sanctions for non-compliance is that there is a penalty which is €100 per tonne if you don't surrender enough allowances, and that's set centrally. But then in addition to that, member states can set out their own penalties, their own sanctions for other sorts of non-compliance under the scheme. And whilst they're all supposed to be dissuasive and sufficiently serious, penalties, there may be some differentiation between how member states do that and indeed how active their competent authorities are in enforcing the regime. So it could make a difference whether a company is more closely associated with one or other member state. And it might actually encourage shipping companies to start thinking about whether they should be trying to operate in future out of a company which they register in a member state instead. So they start off not having an EU presence, but actually perhaps they establish one for this purpose. Although, of course, when doing something like that, there are a whole lot of other things to consider outside of just this scheme. Things like tax and employment rules, I'm sure, would have to be considered there. There's also a particular anti-avoidance measure which the Commission have put in place to cater for the situation where companies send a ship towards the EU that then stops off at a sort of transshipment point just outside of EU waters, and then the journey starts again on the final leg into the EU. What they've said is that you can't use that to avoid paying emissions or counting the emissions for the whole trip into the EU. So I suppose they thought that's one way that people could try to sort of avoid their full obligations under the scheme. So I'm interested, Nick, to hear what you think really as to what level of impact you think this new scheme is going to have on the shipping industry and what you think the key challenges for the industry are going to be.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I think the impact is going to be quite significant. I mean, you and Brett have clearly explained the key features and some of the challenges as well as the opportunities around trading allowances on the carbon market. So some, I think, in the industry will see it as an opportunity, but I think far more will see it as an administrative obligation that's going to require a sea change in many ways in the offices of some of the biggest industry players. I think also from my perspective, as I mentioned earlier, owners and charterers are really going to have to start, and already are, to be fair, thinking about how they're going to address this system arriving in 2024 in their charter parties. And that applies both to existing long-term time charter parties, which is really the type of charter party that this hits, and new fixtures that are being concluded now and in the future. And I think the challenge lies, as I've said, with time charter parties because of the nature of that agreement. In exchange for paying hire, the charterer is using the ship pretty much as it wishes, and it exploits it as an asset for its own commercial gain. And because the ship owner has to comply with the lawful orders and directions of the charterer as to the employment of the ship, then the question arises, well, who should pay for the costs as between the owners and the charterers for complying with EU ETS? After all, it's the charterer's use of the ship, in the eyes of many, its routing, the ports it calls at, the cargoes it loads and discharges, that is dictating the vessel's emissions at any given time and over a compliance year. And so I think just as with CII, the carbon intensity indicator regulations launched at the beginning of this year by the IMO, clauses are now starting to appear pretty quickly in time charter parties that grapple with this. BIMCO, as many will know, have already produced a clause, and I'm seeing across my desk a lot of requests at the moment from ship owners and ship operators, disponent owners, for advice on what to do in their charter parties around the payment and the mechanics of dealing with ETS, and to consider amendments perhaps to the BIMCO clause that can be used in commercial negotiations with charterers, as I say, both in existing contracts and in new ones that have yet to be signed, in advance of 2024. And quite a few themes emerged from that, and we don't really have the time today to have a full discussion of those. But we've been thinking about aspects such as the mechanics of charterers transferring allowances to the owner, where the charterers are going to have to pay for them under the clause. What happens if charterers fail to transfer allowances? Does that put the ship off hire? What can the owner do about that? Is there some default provision requiring owners to purchase them if the charterers are unwilling or unable to do so for any reason. And more generally around cooperation, a sharing of data and reporting of emissions between the parties, I think is going to be key. So I think all those points and more besides will need and do need quite careful consideration in any time charter clause. And that's really the current focus at the moment, certainly that I'm seeing. So, in short, and as you've said, it's a whole new string to the bow for many shipping companies. And all of this, of course, is in the context of a busy time in the shipping industry as it gets to grips with the wider decarbonisation initiatives that apply, CII, EEXI, Fuel EU, and many others.
Thanks, Nick. Well, there's certainly a lot to be digesting there for the industry with all those changes. And I think that brings us to the end of the podcast today. So thank you, everybody, for listening. And we hope you found our insights interesting and helpful. If you've got any questions, please do get in touch with one of us, myself, Nick or Brett, or use your usual contact here at Reed Smith. Thank you.
Trading Straits is a Reed Smith production. Our producer is Ali McArdle. For more information about Reed Smith's energy and natural resources or transportation practices, please email tradingstraits@reedsmith.com. You can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple, Google, Stitcher, and reedsmith.com, and our social media accounts at Reed Smith LLP on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter.
This podcast is provided for educational purposes. It does not constitute legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship, nor is it intended to suggest or establish standards of care applicable to particular lawyers in any given situation. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Any views, opinions, or comments made by any external guest speaker are not to be attributed to Reed Smith LLP or its individual lawyers. All rights reserved.